8,500 BC. Somewhere in a valley of the Zagros Mountains, a woman crouched down and let wild wheat seeds slip through her fingers into the soft earth. She had no idea she had just changed the world. The ancestor of that seed was an unremarkable wild grass. It grew on hillsides across the Middle East, small heads, sparse grains, scattered by the wind. Nobody planted it on purpose. It simply grew near human campsites, got picked up by passing hands, and by chance, a few grains fell into disturbed soil. Then something strange happened. People began to notice that the grasses growing near their camps were producing bigger heads. The plants with tougher stalks, the ones whose seeds didn't fall off on their own, survived. Because humans harvested them and unknowingly replanted them, those plants lived on and multiplied. A few hundred years later, the grass had changed. Larger seeds, sturdier stalks, higher yields. It was no longer a wild grass, it had become wheat. But here's a question worth pausing on. Did humans domesticate wheat, or did wheat domesticate humans? Today, wheat occupies roughly 200 million hectares of the Earth's surface every year. Rice feeds half the world's population. Corn has spread from the Americas to every corner of the globe. These three grasses are among the most successful plants that have ever lived, and the ones who made that possible were us, the species that thought it was in charge. From the perspective of genetic spread, the grains won. Completely. So what was life like before farming? In the 1960s, anthropologist Richard Lee studied the Kung people of southern Africa and reached a conclusion that shocked the academic world. This hunter-gatherer group spent an average of just 15 to 20 hours per week obtaining food. The rest of the time, they slept, talked, danced, and looked up at the stars. Their diet included dozens of wild fruits, tubers, nuts, and meat. They didn't store food they didn't need to. Nature was their warehouse, available whenever they needed it. They didn't settle in one place. They followed the food. No taxes, no landlords, no debt. Anthropologist Marshall Solins later called this way of life the original affluent society. Not because they had a lot, but because their desires and nature's supply were almost perfectly balanced. Then, farming arrived. For a long time, history textbooks told us that the agricultural revolution was the starting point of human civilization, the inevitable direction of evolution, the first step toward prosperity. But starting in the 1980s, a group of archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians began asking different questions. In a 1987 essay, Jared Diamond called agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. He didn't mean farming had no value. He meant we had reflexively assumed that the rise of civilization meant life got better, and the archaeological evidence simply doesn't support that. Yuval Noah Harari went further in *Sapiens*, calling the agricultural revolution history's biggest fraud. Grains increased the total number of humans, but they made life worse for almost every individual. Both arguments sparked enormous debate, but the debate itself tells us something. We have never seriously added up the bill. Today, we will. Here's the question. If agriculture was truly humanity's greatest leap forward, why do the bones at archaeological sites tell a completely different story? In 1973, archaeologists excavating near Franchthi Cave in Greece unearthed a collection of ancient bones and stopped cold. After the transition from hunting and gathering to settled farming, human skeletons became shorter, lighter, and showed significantly more signs of physical stress. In some studies, the difference in average male height between hunter-gatherers and early farmers reached more than 10 centimeters. This wasn't an isolated finding from a single cave. It was a pattern that appeared repeatedly across the agricultural transition. The same trend showed up in the Middle East, in China, in the Americas. In region after region, the shift to farming brought shorter stature, greater skeletal stress, and deteriorating nutrition. The details varied by location, but the pattern was consistent enough to force archaeologists to reconsider a very old story, that farming meant progress. The reason is straightforward. Your diet went from hundreds of wild fruits, nuts, and cuts of meat to getting 80% of your calories from a single grain. This was a massive nutritional contraction. Scientists examining cross-sections of these farmers' bones found dense clusters of lines. Harris lines, growth arrest markers left behind by episodes of starvation, illness, or physical exhaustion. Like tree rings, they recorded every period of suffering, silently and precisely. The teeth tell an even blunter story. Hunter-gatherer populations generally had very low rates of tooth decay. In farming societies heavily dependent on grain, cavities, and gum disease rose sharply. The real culprit was a diet built almost entirely on starch, repetitive, relentless, and nutritionally narrow. Rotting teeth before the age of 40 was not unusual for farmers of that era. Bones and teeth are telling us the same thing. Farming didn't bring happiness first. It brought pain first. But pain wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was what farming did to the human posture. A village in Neolithic China, somewhere near present-day Xi'an. We can call her Axiu. She isn't the sole subject of any single burial report. She is a composite, a reflection of countless Neolithic farming women whose bones archaeologists have uncovered again and again at sites from this period. She may have died in her mid-30s, but if you looked only at her skeleton, you would guess she was much older. Her lumbar vertebrae were curved and deformed, the result of bending over for hours every day, pulling weeds. Her knee joints were severely worn, likely from years of kneeling to grind grain. The bones of her fingers had thickened and gnarled, like the roots of a knotted tree. Axiu was not an exception. Agriculture forced the human body to move in ways it had never evolved to handle. Our spines were built for upright walking. Our knees were built for occasional running. Grain didn't care. It needed you to bend, kneel, and bend again. But Axiu's story has a second layer. Settlement, population density, contaminated water, and prolonged contact between humans and livestock gave pathogens opportunities to spread that had never existed before. Many of the infectious diseases that went on to reshape human history were products of the crowded, animal-filled environments that farming created. In many pre-modern agricultural societies, child mortality was staggering. 1 in 3 or 4 children never reached adulthood. Disease was the bill that settlement sent to humanity. One woman's knees record a life of labor. One village's sickness records the cost of staying put. But when grain began piling up in storehouses, something else appeared alongside it. Power. Now we come to the most expensive cost of all: freedom. Hunter-gatherers worked roughly 15 to 20 hours a week. The rest of their time was spent sleeping, storytelling, dancing, and looking up at the stars. Anthropologists called this the original affluent society, not because they had a lot of things, but because they had time. Farmers had no time. Planting, fertilizing, weeding, harvesting, flood control, pest control, one season rolling into the next, without end. Then grain brought another problem. It was too visible, too measurable, too easy to store. And so, the state was born. Among the earliest written records from Mesopotamia, the most common documents weren't love poems or mythology. They were ledgers, tallies of grain, livestock, and rations. Writing wasn't invented to record stories. It was invented to record how much you owe. The walls of Jericho are among the oldest known fortifications on Earth. The traditional explanation is that they were built to keep enemies out. But historian James Scott, in his book Against the Grain, raised a colder possibility. The walls of early states may have been just as much about keeping people and preventing exhausted farmers from walking away and returning to a freer life. It's a contested argument, but it reminds us of something worth sitting with. The borders of civilization are sometimes also the borders of a cage. Grain built the granary built the state built hierarchy, class, taxation, slavery. All of it grew in the shadow of the storehouse. We didn't invent civilization. We accepted an arrangement. From that moment on, grain was no longer just food. It became tax. It became the ledger. It became the wall. It became civilization itself. At this point, you might want to push back. Good. Let's look at the other side of the ledger. Agriculture fed dense enough populations to allow some people to step away from food production entirely to do other things. Philosophy, architecture, mathematics, medicine. The Parthenon, the printing press, astronomy, none of these were possible in a life of daily migration. Mobility and accumulation are fundamentally incompatible. For the individual, farming may have been a disaster. For the species, it was a replication machine. It made each person's life harder, but made humanity as a whole more numerous, more concentrated, and much harder to wipe out. And here is the most brutal irony of all. The diseases that agriculture unleashed eventually became humanity's most powerful weapon. When Europeans conquered the Americas, their decisive advantage wasn't guns, steel, or horses. It was germs. Diseases like smallpox devastated populations that had never been exposed to them. Only societies that had lived alongside domesticated animals for thousands of years had built up the immunities to survive repeated exposure. The cost of evolution became the advantage of evolution. So, was it worth it? That's not a question I'm here to answer. But one thing is certain. When that woman dropped seeds into the earth 10,000 years ago, she unknowingly signed a contract. And the price written into that contract would be paid by every generation that came after her. Every bowl of rice, every piece of bread. Behind it lies thousands of years of shrinking bodies, rotting teeth, bent spines, and the people who never made it past the wall. Grain has no winners or losers. Neither does humanity. It's just that from that moment on, there was no going back. If this video made you think twice about that bowl of rice, hit the like button and let me know. Our series 10,000 Years, The Human Nature Contract continues. Next episode, we're talking about the cost of domesticating animals who changed who. Subscribe and don't miss a single episode.